friends, it's time for part 3 of my 4-part series about level design for VR. In this video, we'll be sketching the map for your level, guiding you towards the VR environment. By now, if you did the homework from part 2, you should have a completed user journey and a list of assets to help the player reach their goal and create an awesome vibe for your environment. And if you did the extra credit, you even have a story arc or beat chart. We'll start with creating a top-down view map. Sometimes I call this an aerial map, probably from my years working in the civil engineering realm. Here's a simple map that I created for my work-in-progress game, Shadowmend. Traditionally, in level design, there are 2 main ways to sketch out the game's space: alleys and islands. In VR, alleys are going to feel more confining, even though they'll easily point your character in a specific direction. In Shadowmend, I literally start the player in an alley, which you can see here. Another example, which is less literal, is the pathway that I made for my prototype, the Dream Lodge. Placing tall grass on either side of the player confines them to the pathway, but doesn't feel claustrophobic because there are no heavy walls, and you can see the open field. I've also added evening ambient sound and fireflies to light the way. An island space can be more challenging when creating non-VR games, but good for VR because it gives an expansive feel. Using islands in VR can give your player freedom and space to explore and feel more natural, like you're a part of the world. When thinking about your island, you'll want to create visually distinct areas to direct the player. Don't forget to have the level support your primary game mechanics and actions the player needs to take. Color, lighting, visual effects such as glow, and animation can draw attention to what to do. Another thing you can do is place landmarks, which orient the player and get them comfortable and familiar with their surroundings. In this example, the carousel is the most eye-catching centerpiece of the environment, not just because it's elaborate, but it's moving. This asset serves as a good landmark for player orientation within the open layout. Again, in Shadowmend, it starts in an alley, which then goes into an island, the club. Once inside, lighting certain areas would help direct the player. Right now, the bar is glowing the most, so instinctively I might go there first. You may want to encourage the player to explore, but this depends on your gameplay type. Sketch your map as it applies to your project. If you have a long alley, consider adding branches to it so that your player isn't bored walking straight for too long. At the end of a branch, have a reward or something to discover. As you sketch out your map, this is when you can start adding representative images or icons of what the player needs to interact with or what they encounter. Show where your player starts. Place the objects and enemies in relationship to that. Try to maintain the correct scale too, even if it's rough. Depending on how many items you have, you may want to create a legend so that you know what icons represent what game asset. Questions to ask are: what does the player find and where? What are the spatial relationships between various objects in the environment? How big or small does the environment need to be? Here, I sketched right onto paper and started placing those items that were determined earlier in the planning process to help the player reach their goal. Alternatively, you may use grid paper, draw this digitally, or use Legos or something physical. Remember that we're working in 3D, so planning with physical objects and in real-life space is also a good practice, which I'll explain later. Now, for some terminology and drawing suggestions. Most likely, if you're using a headset like the Oculus Quest, you're designing for 6 degrees of freedom, or 6DoF for short. 6DoF in VR means that users can move and interact in 3-dimensional space with 6 distinct movements. This includes the ability to not only look around in all directions with your head, but also physically move and navigate within the virtual world. For example, the ability to walk, turn, crouch, reach, and interact with objects, resulting in a more realistic and immersive experience that closely mirrors natural movements. This level of freedom allows for a more engaging and interactive experience. For 3 degrees of freedom, or 3DOF, something like Google Cardboard, users can look around and explore the virtual environment, but are unable to physically move or navigate within the space. In addition to your aerial map, you may want to include isometric views like this, or drawings like a VR storyboard that show your idea sketched within 3D space. I'll link to a VR storyboard template in the description. I often do both the top view and storyboard. Isometric is something I use more when mapping out interior spaces. Let's check out some other ways to use alleys and islands. There are so many ways to go about this. In the Pika-Seek's Gem Mine, the player moves from alley to island, but is always on a track. So in this case, the track represents the path to follow. Even though the player is constrained to that track, the larger cave areas provide an expansiveness that is more interesting and not so confining. Switching between these different spaces makes the emotion dynamic from area to area. With the county fair, I originally designed this as an open space because I wanted to give that exploration and discovery feel, but you could also place the booths right next to one another and form an alley with them. Maybe you want to confine the player more to make it feel chaotic and busy due to a large crowd. Another thing to consider is boundaries. Clarify where players can and can't go. This is especially true for the open island space. In the Shadow Mend example, the club's walls are an obvious barrier, but in another game, you might want to use plants or other environmental obstacles like the metal barriers in the county fair, or even a visual effect like a shader that reveals only the accessible area, or a vignette. With a vignette, a player will learn that as they approach a certain area, the lighting gets darker so they cannot see, which denotes they've gone too far. It's also possible to place invisible barriers, but if it looks like you can go there, don't disappoint the player with the realization that they can't. You can signify an inaccessible area by lowering the light, muting the colors, or minimizing the details so it's less attention-grabbing and tells the player they can't go there while maintaining a complete environment. A good example of this is in how Dance Central shows the crowd. Further back, the crowd gets less detailed and everyone is blue, which gives the impression that the bar is full, while an icon graphic of feet on the floor shows where to stand. These are just some pleasant ways to set boundaries within a world for the player while maintaining immersion. Before our final video, I want to give you time to sketch your map, as well as any isometric views or a storyboard. That's your homework for part 3. In part 4, the final video of this series, we'll be grayboxing the level in Unity so that you can build this to your headset and test how it feels before adding final assets. See you there.